Romanticism and idealism are one thing. Political reality is another. Reality is governed by boundaries. Romanticism is not. From an artistic point of view, if one is familiar with both the Romantic and Impressionist styles, they each have striking similarities, focusing on individual imagination and interpretation, with a sense of mystery and passion. The brushwork and imagery are distinctly looser and less precise, thereby not as concerned with defined boundaries or objective realism, and more with the formation of the individual's free-thinking subjective ideal. This is important to keep in mind when we consider the concept of the Ubermensch. This ideal was first described in 1883 by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translating to overman, the Ubermensch was meant to represent the ideal future human and embody a goal for humanity to strive towards. A superior man who could rise above old values and conventions, rise above Christian morality. Specifically, to then create and impose his own new values, likely associated with the master-slave morality. It was a revolutionary ideal that strongly influenced and no doubt motivated radical social policies and progressive visions on both the far right and the far left of politics. Objectively speaking, the rationality of wanting to systematically improve humanity is plausible, but at what cost? There is a reason why superheroes like the aptly named Superman and the Avengers are admired in popular culture. They are presented as literal demigods in a modern world devoid of spirituality and higher ideals. The common man would no doubt love to have greater abilities and divine capacities far beyond his current self, which is why creating such a supposedly glorious and mythical figure as the personification of your radical ideology is such an effective method in convincing people to adopt your worldview, particularly if your primary audience is the proletariat, the political representation of the common man or the masses. It should serve as no surprise then that communism and National Socialism were proletariat movements, and both ideologies adopted visions for their own versions of the Ubermensch and used strategic heroic realism in art and propaganda to further their subjective causes. It makes sense to aim to improve humanity, but obviously, ethically, there is a definite moral grey area as to how to go about doing that. Therefore, the scientific eugenics movement that started in the United Kingdom is now largely discredited. Eugenics is utopian by nature, which means it almost inevitably wouldn't work out as planned, on account of unintended consequences. It is just an example of Kantian radical evil, an example of doing something that is considered objectively bad or evil, such as murder, and justifying it with your own subjective righteous cause, i.e., apparently improving humanity. It comes down to whether you can truly live with the possible guilt of doing the bad thing after you've done it. It's the same argument to be anti-abortion or pro-life. Can the mother live with the inescapable fact that we were all once a clump of cells? Can she live with the fact she ended a life? If our parents were as flippant about life as some pro-choice advocates before they had us, we wouldn't even be here to argue over the validity of life. It is very easy to be flippant about life when you've already been born. When life becomes a question of weighing up mere pros and cons, life itself becomes questionable. Nature knows nothing of pros and cons. Nature just is or is not. If you were really aiming at adhering to facts or an evolutionary viewpoint. You wouldn't interfere with what is natural and just let the cards fall as they may. Nature would sort out the weak from the strong, the intelligent from the unintelligent, and natural selection would take its course, rather than a mere mortal playing God by implementing eugenics. From a religious perspective, man is made in the image of God, and God is holy. Thus man has the capacity for perfection already, and was made as God intended. So there was, and is, no need to scientifically try and improve man with eugenics, and no need to aim for a utopia on Earth. Suffice to say, if one were to subscribe to eugenics, one would also have to subscribe to dysgenics. Just as if one were to fully subscribe to the Ubermensch ideal, one would have to subscribe to the possibility of an Untermensch, or underman. It's a case of playing with fire, because what makes the individual think that they will be in the select group that is improved and not impaired by such a plot? The German economist and sociologist Werner Sombart put it best in his 1937 book when he wrote, "In a policy directed toward begetting only a healthy offspring, there is always the danger of lowering our cultural level. If, for example, the unhealthy but the higher ranking in qualities of soul and spirit were excluded from human evaluation. We should not forget that the unusual, highly gifted persons have been, in the biological sense, nearly all classed as sick. At all events, at this point, a very careful medical limitation should be placed upon the definition of sick. We would be interfering with a divine world plan, for which we could hardly afford to assume responsibility. The purely naturalistic treatment of these problems harbours a danger. Therefore, the very greatest caution is in order. Is there a possible risk of a future where individuals are deemed sick or unhealthy for having the wrong opinion or for thinking freely in an increasingly dictatorial world? Not to mention, if you were to claim to believe in eugenics, you would tacitly consent to a Huxleyan-style scientific dictatorship. But you, as the common man, have no place in such an engineered future, much less any power, as all the power would be concentrated in the hands of a few scientific and technocratic elites, who would first create and then run such a system. The Transhumanist Movement is another elitist utopian or dystopian example of improving humanity by aiming to combine humans and machines and ideally uploading consciousness to supercomputers. Yet, is this truly possible though, when there is hardly a unified consensus on what consciousness truly entails? However, supposed impossibility has clearly never stopped the ideologue from trying something in the past, and is unlikely to stop them anytime soon. This is a danger to be acutely aware of. There is also the questionable aspect of the material nature of eugenics in its approach to race. If we're going to refer to race at all, perhaps we start with a question. Do race and spirit coincide? Do you have race, or in the spiritual sense of Western man, have the Faustian spirit, if you just happen to be white but are still hateful toward your history, guilt-ridden and self-loathing? You could argue that self-loathing white people are less Western in spirit, at least, than non-white people who fully accept, understand, and embrace the Western culture and Faustian ideal. So, is material racial purity as important as simply maintaining the spiritual ideal? Granted, there is possibly at least some small relationship between race and spirit or perceived identity. It's definitely a strong argument to suggest that if the white European were to totally disappear or be outbred, the presence and therefore significance of Western ideals and spirit could disappear as well. But organic cyclical history suggests that all cultures have life cycles, and the fate of the great cultures has always been a tragic one. Looking specifically at the history of German politics, firstly during the interwar period of 1918 to 1932, one of the significant nuanced differences in ideology for us to be mindful of is between the popular German conservative revolutionary movement and the ultimately prevailing Nsdap, National Socialist German Workers' Party. A particular difference in opinion was on the subject and importance of race. The conservative revolutionaries considered the spirit, deeds, and culture of an individual or group to typically be of greater significance for the German nation than merely their race. The conservative revolutionaries are often wrongly lumped together with the National Socialists because of a lack of nuance in understanding and a reluctance to properly research the movement because of its apparent close ties to National Socialism. In this video, we shall attempt to outline some important differences. The conservative revolutionary movement was made up of various German intellectuals, academics, and cultural figures. They persistently thought against the grain. They stood in opposition to communism, liberalism, as well as Hitler and the National Socialist regime. Many of the conservative revolutionaries had aristocratic leanings or preconceived, staunchly held religious beliefs. So the prospect of a proletariat-based, strictly racialist, morally questionable and utopianistic party did not appeal to them at all. The origin and development of the movement can be traced from such important figures as Friedrich Nietzsche, Richard Wagner, Oswald Spengler, Thomas Mann, Arthur Moller Vandenbroek, Ernst Junger, Carl Schmitt, Hans Zehrer, Werner Sombart, Edgar Julius Jung, and many others. There was certainly ample evidence of ideological resistance to the NSDAP coming from the right wing. The idea that the wrong ruler was in power was widespread among disgruntled conservative revolutionaries. Some of them even believed that sheer madness was in power and that the greatest folly in German history would ensue. But the path to taking decisive action against it was long and arduous. Both Oswald Spengler and Arthur Moller Vandenbroek separately met with Hitler on a few occasions, but were left largely unimpressed by him and his vision for Germany. Eventually, one of Spengler's books was banned for its scathing critique of National Socialism. Spengler met with Hitler in 1933, but was generally underwhelmed, calling him a heroic tenor when what we need is a hero. Spengler also did not share his anti-Semitic views. In his private notes he wrote, "When one would rather destroy business and scholarship than see Jews in them, one is an ideologue, i.e. a danger for the nation, idiotic." Another quote directly out of Spengler's Prussian Socialism and Other Essays is as follows: "All the great successes of statesmen like art and clever popular instincts were the result of cool contemplation, long silence and waiting, hard self-control, and above all, a fundamental renunciation of intoxication and spectacles. Once again, great success in traditional statecraft came from a fundamental renunciation of intoxication and spectacles." This is no doubt a subtle insight into why Spengler was particularly dubious of Hitler, especially given Hitler no doubt revelled in the attention and drama that came with the spectacle of a rousing speech or a passionate rally. Many of the conservative revolutionaries were offered roles and positions of power within the party, but refused to submit to pressure or radicalize their beliefs. Ultimately, Hitler perceived the movement as a rival threat, and to consolidate his power, he ordered purging executions to eliminate much of the dissent in an event known as the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Another example of resistance came against the regime from within the Wehrmacht, combined armed forces of Nazi Germany itself, culminating in a failed plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler and remove the Nsdap from power on the 20th of July 1944. The name Operation Valkyrie, originally referring to a component of the conspiracy, has become synonymous with the event. The leading conspirators in the coup, namely Klaus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Treschow, and Erwin von Witzleben, each had ancestral links to old nobility in Germany. Thus, their ideal political system was more aligned with Prussian socialism, and an ideal leader in a more Bismarckian mold and or the monarchy of Imperial Germany known as the Second Reich, which existed from the unification of Germany in 1871 until the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm in 1918. Most of the conservative revolutionaries who did join the NSDAP seem to have done so out of necessity to survive. For example, Carl Schmitt acted on unique motives. Whilst there may have been some sense of budding ambition and a weakness of character involved in his decision, Schmitt predominantly relied on his own rather rational theory. In civil war, he went over to the winning side and joined the only party he believed to be capable of carrying out its plans that could establish peace or a sense of concrete order in the nation. Lastly, looking at the story of the Third Reich and its leader in an objective sense, it is both extraordinary, coming from virtual obscurity and abject poverty to become the leader of a nation and conquer much of Europe, and starkly indicative of what can happen if a people first feel sufficiently or subjectively justifiably aggrieved for long enough, and then get swept up in the euphoria of achieving the unthinkable, namely restoring the German economy after World War I and overcoming the Treaty of Versailles in record time to make Germany relevant again in world politics. All the while fully submitting to the rampant megalomania of an exceptionally charismatic leader. Goethe once said, "Germany is one in love for one another, and is always one against the foreign enemy." Thus, whilst there are genuine benefits to closer and more intimate communal ties, there is also an elevated risk of susceptibility to historically evident mass hysteria. There is a very fine line between genius and madness, friend and enemy, glorious success and abject failure.